Running 12 crits isn't probably as good as you might think.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, if you watched yesterday's video or you've been keeping yourself up to date with the latest news in Vanguard, you might know that we're getting a new starter deck in a couple of months. And these are the new starter decks for Royal Paladin and Shadow Paladin with the respective Blaster Blade and Blaster Dark support. And in this starter deck, it's basically a complete reprint set except for one special card. They include a new crit trigger for both clans. So that means that Shadow Paladin as well as Royal Paladin will have access to a third critical trigger. And everybody knows what that means. But will these 12 crit builds be as successful as they did in the past? As well as, will these new crit triggers have a special kind of effects? Today we're going to talk about both these questions in contrast with game and deck design aspect tailored to them, and see how this might come into fruition when these cards are actually released, with or without skills. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today is, will 12 crit builds be as successful as some people suggest they will be? For anybody that hasn't been playing Vanguard before Standard, in the G era, and basically before even G era, every deck had a lot of different triggers to their disposal, and they could basically make any kind of any type of trigger lineup they liked. They could run 16 draws, 16 crits, 4 heals, 12 stands, or whatever they wanted. Basically anything was accessible to them. And the most generic of them all were the 12 crit 4 heals builds. And that has seen the most success during most of Vanguard's history, as seen as a lot of decks already have a lot of draw potential or restanding or any other kind of playability, except for the extra pressure with the crits. And crits were the best way to close games. But with the whole standard aspect of trigger lineup, the most crits you could run was the typical 8 crits. And that meant you have 8 other triggers left in your trigger lineup to fill out with heals, fronts, or draws. And in most cases for the Force clans and the Protect clans, that would mean just 4 heals and at least 4 draws, if not more. And if the triggers were exactly the same as in the previous G era, then adding this third crit trigger in the mix would basically mean that yes, Shadow Paladin and Royal Paladin will run from that point onwards 12 crit 4 heals. No doubt about it. But as everybody knows, that's not the case, because when Standard was introduced with the reboot, they also introduced the new draw PGs. And these draw PGs have made a big impact in the game. And I think this is one of the reasons why the 12 crit build might not be as prevalent as most people would suggest it will be. Because now we have a draw trigger that also functions as a Perfect Guard. And because we can now fit a Perfect Guard in our trigger lineups, we have an extra slot open in our Grade 1 lineup. For anybody that hasn't played Vanguard before the reboot was a thing, just like that there were more triggers into the mix before the reboot for every clan, also Perfect Guards were only accessible as a Grade 1 option. So you needed to sacrifice 4 Grade 1s to be able to fit 4 Perfect Guards in your deck. And for the triggers, that meant that you had no incentive to run draw triggers, except if you actually needed a draw effect or a draw trigger had a good effect. But most draw triggers didn't have really great effects at the time. So it was basically if you needed the draws or not. But with the introduction of draw RPGs, 2 major things happened. 1, draw triggers suddenly got a big bump in their usability, as they now have 2 big things they accomplish in the deck. Not only do they draw more cards, but as well function as a Perfect Guard that fixes its own discard cost if you hit its trigger effect, because you then draw 1 extra card which you can discard for the Perfect Guard. So you fix the issue of a Perfect Guard as well as have more incentive to run a draw trigger. But the other big thing that it introduced in the deck building aspect is the fact that we now have 4 Grade 1 slots open to put any other kind of card in our deck. Both of these things contributed to the fact that decks became a lot more consistent. You can now run 4 different new Grade 1 cards that could help your engine in whatsoever, as well as you now are running 4 extra draw triggers, meaning you will have more draw ability in your deck. Yes, you might sacrifice a little bit more pressure because you're running less crits, but with the potential of that new grade 1 and the extra draw effect in your deck, you might go faster through your deck, and meaning you will hit faster for your OTK or kill combo or your good playability combos. That kind of stuff will go faster and more consistent. If Royal Paladin and Shadow Paladin now want to run 12 crits, at least in standard that is the case, they need to sacrifice their draw PGs, or they need to sacrifice their heals. But then that will mean they either need to make a choice to run Perfect Guards in their grade 1 slot, or don't run Perfect Guards at all. And the way that everybody's now building their decks, they don't tend to have room for the Perfect Guards. For example, the new Blaster build that's coming through with the upcoming support set with Masonic Lord Blaster, there is no room whatsoever. You have 3 different grade 2s that are all blasters, and you have 2 grade 1s that already been confirmed to be blasters, but we still have Blast Sword left. That one has to be revealed as a grade 1. So that means you already have 3 spots, so that's 12 cards, as you're probably gonna run 4 copies of each. So if you now want to run a Perfect Guard, you either need to scrap one of the blasters entirely, or you need to run them at 3 copies and then make somewhere another room so you can run 4 Perfect Guards. So that means you dropping your deck consistency to then run the 12 crits. You can also say, you know what, I'm not gonna run Perfect Guards at all for the blaster build. I'm just gonna run 12 crits and then all the blasters, and that's about it. Well, then you run into the problem. You're a Force Clan. Anything that hits for a high enough number, you're screwed. So if you're against the mirror, the one that's gonna hit its blaster, Masonic Blaster skill first with the 6 crits, probably will win the game because you have no Perfect Guard. Same can be said for the Shadow Paladin. Their deck is pretty damn filled out with all their important cards. Their grade 1s are all the main supporting cards with their 5k grade 1s, as well as some attackers. If they want to run Perfect Guards with the 12 crit build, they now need to drop some grade 1s that are very important for their deck consistency. And you can see that this might be an issue for not only Shadow Paladin and Royal Paladin, but as well for other decks that might get the third crit trigger in the near future. Even for Oracle Think Tank, yes. Having 12 crits for Oracle Think Tank is very dangerous, but at least they need to drop some cards if they run some extra Perfect Guards beside their Protect markers. They, on the other hand, can say, well, we're not going to run any more other cards, other Perfect Guards. Besides that, we have Protect markers, that's fine. But then again, they also lose the draw PG effect. And you shouldn't underestimate the fact that draw triggers in Oracle Think Tank make a big difference. I have won and lost many games because either I hit a good amount of draw triggers, or my opponent that's also playing Oracle Think Tank hits a good amount of draw triggers. Those draw triggers make a difference. And the fact that we're now need to force to sacrifice those cards, and we need to put our Perfect Guards in our grid 1 slots to fit those 12 crits, might not be a good enough reason to run 12 crits, at least in standard. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about is the potential of these triggers having skills. One of you guys, NorPoet97, commented on the fact that if they give these triggers effects, they should make their power plus 5k instead of 10k. And to be honest, that's a very interesting idea, as in the previous era of Vanguard, all triggers were plus 5k. So whenever they introduced a crit trigger, stand trigger, draw trigger, whatsoever with an effect, there was no more reason to run the vanilla trigger anymore, as it was very logical. You will go with the one with the skill. Even if you cannot use the skill that often, at least it's an upgrade when you look at the one without a skill. Sure, they have a power difference, as the vanilla triggers had 5k power and the triggers had 3 or 4k, but 99 out of 9% chance you do not call those triggers to the field, so that power on the card could just be 0 for that matter, as you usually do not call them to the field for boosting or something. Can happen, but usually not. However, now with the reboot, triggers have plus 10k. So why would they not just say, well, if we're gonna introduce triggers with effect, and I'm not stating that this new trigger will have an effect, it's just they haven't clearly stated if it will or will not. They say a special kind of trigger, so who knows what that means. But if they have an effect, I think it's a very smart idea to make them less powerful in a sense. So you will balance out, as well as have more deck design choices. And in Premium, you already see this with people are deciding, do I want to have the very powerful skill, or do I want to have the more defensive and offensive capability of the trigger effect, as well as the higher shield rating. So Bushiroad can bring that to standard as well by making these triggers with effect have either less shield value, less trigger power, so if you get them as a trigger, it doesn't get plus 10k but plus 5. And sure, they can make the power on the card a little bit lower, but I think they shouldn't balance it around that fact, as huge players do not really tend to place triggers on the field. Usually when they do that, it's because they have literally no other thing to do. And with markers now, that power doesn't mean shit, as even if it's a 4k, 5k, or 6k trigger on an Exo Force, it still beats over anything, so that doesn't really matter. But that's basically all for me today on this subject. Let me know in the comments down below what your guys' opinion is about the potential of a third crit trigger for Shadow and Royal Pennant, and for basically any other decks and clan that's probably gonna get this in the future, as well as triggers with effect in standard, if you like that idea or not. And how do you think it should be balanced in a way that, should it just be same power, same thing we've seen in the G era, but they have now skills attached to them? Or do you think they should balance it in some way to have an incentive to run them or not over vanilla triggers or not? So we have more deck building options and more varieties within decks between players. But that's all for me today. I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one.